Well, good morning. You know that expression, it takes a village to raise a child? Hey, Isaac, how are you? Well, there you go, right on cue. Well, I think it takes a village to do anything that's worthwhile. And it also takes a Caroline and a My Life team to create a village, but clearly we're going to have to help them along the way. So it's great that we are here among 17 nations of the earth to talk about the audacity of thinking that we are sufficient unto each other. And it's wonderful to have the privilege to welcome you all here on behalf of so many people who've worked so hard to make this happen. I was thinking this morning, you know, we live in a magical time, genuinely. And it's easy to say stuff like that, but one of the things that is apparent in the world today is that there are more people alive today than have ever died in the history of the human race. Now, some people have been trained to think that's a problem. But what's significant and maybe even unique is the people in this room do not see it as a problem, but as a profound opportunity. Because we view those kinds of realities through the lens of abundance, not scarcity. So it gives me great joy to welcome you to a conversation about abundance. One of the things that is really apparent to me, because I'm a European, I'm also not from here, I'm from Ireland, is that I think steadily and slowly Europe is progressing to a point where it is asserting the values of localism and inclusion. And I want to say that because many of you have traveled from outside of Europe, and I want to give you a sense of where you've arrived into. So let me share 3 personal observations of what is really alive for me around Europe, which gives me hope that we're actually winning the argument around localism over massification and giantism. The first is what's happening in Greece. It's tricky waters at the moment, choppy waters, but the recent Greek elections, to my mind, are profoundly significant. I don't think that people just voted against austerity. I think what they also did was they voted for a different kind of prosperity. A prosperity that is grounded in localism, in the values of indigenous living, and in asserting the importance of cooperation over competition. So to our friends in Greece, I salute you, because you are profoundly inspiring, not just to your fellow citizens, but to the world. And it gives you hopefully a sense of where you've arrived into for those who are traveling into Europe. And who cannot be struck by the significance of the conversation that's happening right now in Scotland. Just a few weeks ago, well, months ago now, 3,619,000 people turned out to cast a yes or no vote in a referendum, not just about independence, but a referendum that was about shaping the destiny of the communities that live in Scotland. It was a vote that actually set a new UK record. Since the introduction of universal suffrage in 1918, we have never seen a turnout like it. 84.5% of people came out to vote. Now, who can claim after something like that people don't care anymore, or people don't turn out to vote? People do care, but they might not necessarily care about party political politics anymore. The schism isn't between the right and the left. The schism is between citizens and the governments that represent them and are there to serve them. One of the things that's significant, I think, about this conference is that yesterday, which was the start of the festival, I have to stop calling it a conference. It's a festival. Was, as you know, June 15th. And June 15th, some 800 years ago, King John in England introduced the Magna Carta, or what is often known as the Magna Carta Libertatum, the Great Charter of Liberties. It was the beginning of a long, slow, and often painful journey, a journey of devolution from central power bases to local people. And you need only look a few miles up the road to Manchester, excuse me. Some people here in the room wish it was. But to Manchester, where we're seeing, again, another conversation, a conversation about people becoming masters of their own destiny in very real terms, and a devolution of power from Westminster to the folks who live in Manchester. It's really practically, but also symbolically very significant, and gives you, I think, an indication for those, as I say, who traveled from outside of Europe, of where you've arrived into. You are among friends. Practically speaking, these are really big moments in time. And I think the difficulty with big moments in time is that sometimes they mask, they conceal what ordinary people have done to make those big moments possible. So I want to share with you a story from a citizen, somebody who, if they were asked the question, are you a citizen or do you just live around here, would say resolutely, I am a citizen. This man, Damien Carter, moved into his neighborhood some 20 years ago. And he realized that he knew nobody, but also that he was among a group of people who were more likely to be watching an episode of the American sitcom Neighbors than they were to be making friends with their neighbors. And he decided to do something about that. He started 20 years ago on his own street by giving every single one of his neighbors a Christmas card. Over the last 20 years, Damien Carter has got to know 4,500 of his neighbors in person. He knows them by name. He knows their dogs, if they have dogs, by name. He knows their kids. He knows where they go to school. He's not a stalker. He's a citizen. So let's hear from Damien as he describes what it means to be a citizen.
Hi, my name's Damien Carter. I'm the Opportunities Manager here at Romford. Part of the reason
Damien, I think, gives tribute and testimony to the fact that all enduring change actually comes from bottom up. It's grassroots. And as I've said, sometimes that gets obscured. It's hard to see in the big moments these ordinary but profoundly significant contributions. We're here today, and I think, if I'm counting correctly, we are welcoming some 17 different countries into this room to have a conversation. Now, the examples that I've just given you, of course, are not unique. They're stories, I think, that come from all over the world. So we have people from the United States of America, from Australia, from Brazil, from Canada, from Ethiopia, from Germany, from India, from Iran, from the island of Ireland, from Italy, from Kenya, from the Netherlands, from New Zealand, from Portugal, from South Africa, from Spain, from Sweden, from Vietnam, from England, Scotland, and Wales. Have I missed anybody? Shout it out. Hey, welcome, you made it. That's fantastic. We are delighted you're here. We could not have done this without you. Well done. Syria, fantastic. Where have you been all our lives? Fantastic. Wonderful. You know, our stories, I believe, even though they're very diverse and their power is in their specificity, it's the power of particularity. Each of our stories are very, very much grounded in the places we come from. But I think our stories also have commonality. There are aspects to our stories that join us together and bind us. Nietzsche, the philosopher, once said that the world is not the totality of things, it's the totality of facts. Well, if I could be a little bit bodacious and say I totally disagree. I think the world is neither the totality of things nor the totality of facts, but it is the totality of stories. Stories about how we've used what's wrong to address what's wrong. Stories about how we've used what's strong to make what's strong even stronger and deeper. Stories, as Father Moses Cody reminded us, that are about using what we have to secure what we want. And even going further and using what we don't have to inspire us to use what we do have to secure what we want together. These are stories also that have pain. We're not Pollyanna. We're not naive people. We're not politically the people who just get along and accept what we've been given. We are people who also stand four square together against forces that would do us over. The African-American poet Maya Angelou said it best when she said, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise." We are a resilient and a defiant people, because that is also our way. And those stories that bring us together are stories that we're going to share over these next few days. And yet, what we've all responded to in the call to be here at this festival is this idea of asset-based community development. And in the late 80s, when John, who is sitting right here, John McKnight, John, can I ask you just to stand up and say hi? Co-director of the ABCD Institute. And Jody Kretzmann, his partner in crime, co-director of the ABCD Institute. When they began the journey of trying to pay attention to what it is people do when they behave effectively together in their neighborhoods, across North America, some 20 cities, some 300 neighborhoods, over a 4-year odyssey, and they gathered those first 3,000 stories. They were always really clear that these stories are North American stories. They're not stories that you can extrapolate a universal principle and apply to every other culture, because they're specific to that culture. Neither John nor Jody nor any of the other people that were involved in that odyssey have ever tried to promote the idea that what made sense in the North American context should make sense everywhere else. But here's the thing. Over the last 20 years, something profoundly significant has happened, and it has had nothing to do with the ABCD Institute. People like you from all over the world read books like this, the Green Book, which described what people do when they behave effectively in communities and also what they use. And what they said, from Haiti and every other part of the world that's represented here today, and many that are not, is we see ourselves in that narrative. And that is something, I think, of profound consequence. So, to my mind, this is a real social movement. It wasn't triggered by an institution. It has emerged because folks behaving like citizens said we could see ourselves in that story. And to me, that is of huge significance as we think about social change and social justice. It strikes me that even though the ABCD Institute is addressed and located at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, it's actually more locatable in the hearts and the minds and the practice of people just like you who are building community all over the world. So you are ABCD. You are the movement. One of the things I think is most significant about the ABCD perspective, because it's not a model, it is a perspective, is that it emphasizes not just that assets are central to urban and rural revitalization, but actually that the critical thing is how those assets get connected up. In every community without exception, and in every individual and association, there are assets, there are strengths. But when those strengths get connected, when they get joined in productive, playful, creative action, that's when enduring change results. So we are here today to celebrate that connection and also to grow and deepen our old connections and make new ones. We, as an organizing committee, thought, we should try to create some perspective for the conversations that we're going to have over these next 2 days. So we thought looking back 20 years would be a manageable way to do that. But it's really important that we acknowledge that the history and the heritage of ABCD goes a lot further back than 20 years. And tomorrow we'll be launching a book called Looking Back to Look Forward in the morning, which tells some of that story and brings you right back to the 1950s. So you get a better sense of the folk that have been involved in helping to create and frame the thinking and the practice of ABCD. More on that tomorrow. These next few days, we're going to try to think and listen into each other's conversations around three key themes. The first is around a culture of community, and it's today's theme. What does that mean? How do you make that manifest in a way that actually calls citizenship into action? Tomorrow, we'll be thinking about the idea that what people are in pursuit of is a life, not a service. And what does that mean? And how do we situate that in conversations that are very much dominated by this idea that people need programs and they need services to be well? On the third day, we're going to be talking about this idea of the politics of small things. This notion that ordinary people in ordinary neighborhoods can come together and by joining intentionally their assets can do extraordinary things. What does that mean for the world we're in? So as well as looking back 20 years, we're hoping to look forward 20 more and begin to read the tea leaves, begin to think about what are we being called to here over these next 20 years? What do we want to make visible? To help us with some of that thinking, we have a range of speakers and facilitators, and I briefly want to introduce each by name. So John, just a few moments ago, stood up, and John will be speaking straight after me, and he'll be sharing what he has learned over the years, journeying around communities. Pretty much, I would imagine, John, you've been in nearly all of these countries at different stages. So he'll be sharing what he's learning, but also his hope for community and society into the future. And Jody will be doing pretty much the same thing. Jody is one of life's great facilitators as well as a wonderful, wonderful speaker. So he's also going to be helping us to facilitate ourselves into thinking about what next? Where are we going here? And how can we be intentional about inviting the voice of young people? And we have the voice of one. You shouldn't worry, by the way, if she's crying. That's community, okay? This is good. It's normal. How do we do that? How do we invite the voice of young people in intentionally and also relocate the authority so they really leave these 3 days feeling like they are not alone part of a movement, but they are the leaders of today in this movement? And Jody will be helping us with that. We also have Peter Kenyon. Peter, where are you? Peter, welcome. Peter comes from Australia. He's also the director of a wonderful and I think multi-generational initiative called Bank of Ideas, which has been in itself the seedbed of huge movements all over the world. Real pleasure to have Pete with us. We are really conscious of the fact that these next 3 days are about facilitating conversation and not just talking heads. So we have Dee. Dee, can you stand up? Yeah? And Deb and Dan, and they're our team of facilitators, and they will be looking for other people who are drawn to facilitation to help to stimulate those conversations. They'll be holding 3 key questions, as will we all actually throughout these days. The first question is, what is it that community is uniquely capable of doing without any help from outside? What is that? The second question is, what is community uniquely capable of doing with some help from outside, but it's the kind of help that doesn't displace or overwhelm? And the final question they'll be holding for us and inviting us into is, what's left for the institutional and technological world that they must do alone, but in an accountable way? We also have Professor John Ashton, who is the president of the Faculty of Public Health. John, I think, is over here. John, welcome. And John will be reminding us that what determines our well-being primarily is our community assets, not our access to Medicare or big pharma pills. We also have Dr. Martin Galvin from the University of Limerick. Welcome, Martin. And Martin will be sharing some really interesting research around the disabling effect of institutions when it comes to learning and growing power at the grassroots level. He'll be reminding us that real learning happens in community. It's not the sole purvey of schools and universities. We also have Alison Matthew and Gord Cunningham from the Coady International Institute, and they'll be sharing stories from across the global south as they've been working intentionally with ABCD. And Tom Dewar was to be with us today, but unfortunately his wife has been taken ill, so he's with her, and we send them our best. Tom was going to facilitate us in a conversation about gappers. So we're going to have somebody, hopefully maybe Jody can help us with that, really just lead that conversation. And what we want to explore there, and what Tom would have done if he could be with us, is we want to explore what is it that people who occupy the space between the institutional world and the community world do in a way that keeps the institutional world back a little bit so that the community world can expand its space and its authority. So I think of gappers as like border foxes. They patrol the borderland and they snap at the heels of institutions that try and take community space. So my understanding is there are quite a few gappers in the room, and we're going to invite them up, maybe with Jody's facilitation, to be part of that. We also have Sean Samuels and Hannah Nell from South Africa. Sean is with us from the Technical Support and Dialogue Platform, and Hannah is with us from the University of Johannesburg. They're going to share with us some 23 stories of change that is intentionally through the lens of ABCD across South Africa. And I was speaking with Sean this morning, and I was absolutely enthralled by what they're learning. So I think you'll find that fascinating. Colleen Cameron's going to share some of her intentional thinking about how she has been supporting communities in Canada to measure their own health-producing capacities. At least that's my understanding of it. I think there may be different language, but I'm really excited by that. Welcome, Colleen. Richard Perry, who's at the back DJing at the moment, will also be helping us to record through social media what it is we're learning and sharing together. But he is also going to be inviting the rest of the world in. We have a hashtag. I'm not sure where the hashtag is written up, but we will get it written up. So it's hashtag ABCD Fest 2015. So if you are a tweeter, if you're somebody who tweets, or otherwise known as a twit, then please twit on. It's with a great degree of sadness, but also a great degree of joy that I say that we were looking forward to Judith being with us. Sadly, Judith passed away on the 31st of May, a little over 2 weeks ago. And it is with real sadness, but Judith has left us such an amount to celebrate. And she would be very cross with us if we didn't celebrate what it is that she has shared through her wisdom and legacy. So tomorrow, we'll be celebrating Judith Snow, and we'll be remembering her call to action, and there have been many. But one of the things that really struck me most about Judith was just a couple of hours before she left, she was planning her trip to come across. And I think her sense of humor, which was profoundly quirky, and her faith perspective would have been such that she would have said, God chose a truly inconvenient time to call her. But we will remember her fondly tomorrow. You know, an awful lot of what we're trying to do is, in my mind, as well as looking back 20 years, looking forward 20 years, is trying to get some perspective, some clarity, what I call 2020 vision. So our invitation to each of you is to think back over the last 20 years and think about what has resonated for you when it comes to building communities from the inside out. And think forward 20 more about what your hopes are. What do you hope that you're going to be able to make visible? What are you going to do on your street as well as in your practice? When I think about my own practice, the person that I think I am most grounded by died some 20 years ago. It was my grandmother. So when I think about being accountable or reporting to my grandmother what it is I've learned, I think that's what makes most sense and most clarifying for me. My grandmother grew up in Limerick in the west of Ireland. She grew up in tough times, really tough times. The author Frank McCourt said of the times that she grew up when she was a child, it was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood. And worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood. But she knew the other side of that story. She knew the importance of neighbours. People like Kitty, people like Lizzie Noonan, people who shared one alarm clock in the community of Ballinacurra Weston, the sugar for the tea, and the care of young and old across the life course, at a time when most of the menfolk were no longer in Limerick because they had travelled to London and Australia and to many of the countries that are represented here to find work. She knew the power of community. So I think if I was to say, well, here's what I've learned over the last 20 years, I'd say, Nana, this is what I've figured out by sitting at the feet of citizens all over the world. Community has a job to do. And if we don't do it, it won't get done. There is no replacement from the technological world or the professional world. They just simply cannot replace us. And I think that job is to produce the things that never get used up, no matter how many people use them. In fact, to produce the things that the more they get used, the greater they are. Our job is to produce abundance, to produce things like friendship, wisdom, playfulness, creativity, and love. And I think she would probably say, Cormac, I've been saying that for years, but without the fancy words. I don't believe that my grandmother lived in the golden age of community. But where and when she did live was in a place and in a time that had the capacity to remember the irreplaceable functions of community in a way that I think was easier than it is today. Milan Kundera, a European author, very, very famous, very skilled, masterful author, wrote a book, and the book was called The Book of Laughter and Forgetting. And in it he says, the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. We organize these festivals lest we forget, because we live in a world where it is easy to forget the power of community. So we are here to remember, and that's a profoundly important act. And it's an act of community. It's an act of citizenship. I don't think my mother or my grandmother would have ever used words like democracy. I don't think it would have made any sense to them, really. But they enacted democracy. One of my favorite quotes is a quote from Walt Whitman where he says, "We have frequently printed the word democracy, yet I cannot too often repeat that it is a word, the real gist of which still sleeps. A great word, whose history, I suppose, remains unwritten, because that history has yet to be enacted." So will we be the people that enact that history? I think so, and I think that's exactly what we're doing. These next 3 days are also a celebration of Jody and his great achievement and contribution in the world, and of John and his great achievement and contribution in the world. And what's significant about these two men is right now they're cringing because they don't want public adulation. Their stewardship of this movement has always been to convene a circle of friends and not be in the center. But nonetheless, I want to use this opportunity to acknowledge you both and to say thank you for all you've contributed. People all over the world, as a consequence of what you have done, have had a point of clarification, a point of confirmation, and often a point of liberation as a result of the way you have framed their efforts in the world. Alexander Pope said it best when he said, "True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed." So to you both, hats off and thank you. Give them a round of applause. I'd like to conclude, if I may, with just it's not quite a poem, but it's in the vicinity of a poem, which is an attempt to summarize everything that I've learned from my grandmother, from John and Jody and colleagues, and also from the communities that I serve. It's called Perhaps. Perhaps we don't need more startups. We need more upstarts, heretics, and radicals. Perhaps seemingly useless small things can become the solutions to our biggest problems. Perhaps children raise parents, and pupils teach teachers, and patients heal doctors and nurses. Perhaps the left thinks the right is wrong, and the right thinks the left is wrong, and that's what's wrong. Perhaps the enemy at the boardroom table is a friend at the kitchen table. Perhaps we are not self-reliant. We are other-reliant. Perhaps we don't need more leaders who tell us, this is the way. We need more connectors who help us create our way. Our way is the community way. It's not a perfect way. It's not the way of God's. It's not a technological way, but it's our way. And in all its fallibility and its perfection, it's the only way that we can grow and create abundance. But we'll only really realize the full import of that way if, as John and Jody constantly remind us, we can create a welcome for the stranger at the edge. It was one of Judith's favorite terms. But also, if we can figure out how to ensure people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. You know, I think if my grandmother was here, and if Judith was here, they might right about now say, get on with it. So with that gentle nudge, I say to you, on with the revolution, and on with the festival. Thank you.